My name is Meredith Forsyth, and I'm the chair of the Georgetown University College Democrats. I see plenty of familiar faces in the room. I'm a sophomore here in the SFS, so I'm still in midterm season now. But I'm so excited to be involved with the Battleground Virginia series. It's a great opportunity for me to bring this great opportunity to empower members to get involved in this really important local election. And yeah, let's go ahead and introduce our guests for the night. So moderating our discussion this evening is Mr. Michael Shear on the right here. Mr. Shear is a White House correspondent for the New York Times in the paper's Washington Bureau, where he has covered the presidency for the past 7 years. Before moving to the Times, he was a correspondent for the Washington Post. A member of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team that documented the shootings at the Virginia Tech campus in 2007, Mr. Shear is a 1990 graduate of Claremont McKenna College and has a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So that's Mr. Michael Shear.
Hey.
And then let's introduce our keynote speaker of the night, Mr. Tom Perriello. And I just want to say personally, as a student of international affairs and African politics in particular, I'm so excited to introduce Mr. Perriello. Born and raised in Charlottesville, Virginia, Tom has been a teacher, a nonprofit executive, a congressman, and a diplomat. And if that's on our resume to aspire to, then I don't know what it is, right? Beginning in 2001, Tom supported peace negotiations and transnational justice issues in conflict zones all around the world, including Sierra Leone, Darfur, the Balkans, and Afghanistan. In 2008, Tom ran for and won a seat in Congress representing the 5th District of Virginia, where he worked on a ton of issues, including economic fairness, veterans, education, and much more. Later, he served as the CEO of the Center for American Progress, or CAP Action Fund. And in 2014, he was tasked with leading the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, as an executive review of State Department and USAID operations. And most recently, Tom was appointed Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region of Africa by the Obama administration. Now he is back to domestic politics, running for governor of Virginia. Tom is a graduate of Yale University and Yale Law School. So let's have a round of applause. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Michael Shear to moderate our discussion. Thank you once again so much for coming out tonight, and I hope you enjoy the program.
It's great. Thank you guys for being here. My bio had less difficult words to say. So I'm glad to be here. I actually was invited by Mo Alithi, who's the head of the institute here, who I knew when he was just a young communications aide to a campaign back in Virginia, and so I've covered Virginia had covered Virginia for a long time. So that's, I think, part of the reason why Mo invited me to be here. And if it wasn't on like Facebook Live and stuff, I'd tell you all sorts of funny stories about Mo since he's not here. But since it's on live TV, we'll skip that part.
We can pause it.
Well, that's, yeah. So welcome to the discussion with Tom Perriello, one of the two candidates. Are there any like
For Democratic side?
Democratic side? There's only two. So the two candidates for governor on the Democratic side in Virginia. Virginia, for those of you who don't know, is one of the two states that holds off-year elections. New Jersey is the other one. So Virginia is often seen as a real important state, as a bellwether for getting a sense of what the broader electorate thinks a year into a president's term. It's often thought of as a way that we can sort of sense where things are going or are likely to go in the midterm elections in 2018. So we can watch it carefully. It's also made even more so than New Jersey a kind of focus of national attention just because of its proximity to Washington and national political reporters who are lazy and don't want to go very far, and so they go to Virginia and cover a race. In particular, this one is also a kind of more nationally focused race, in part because of Tom's entry into the race and his focus on national issues and sort of bringing a lot of discussion about Donald Trump and the national political climate and environment that we find ourselves in 2017, and so that's also added to the intensity of people watching this race, and in some ways become a kind of the Democratic primary becoming a kind of proxy for some of the continuation of some of the themes that the Democrats So with that, what I thought we would do is I've got a few questions that I sort of wrote up. We'll sort of get it started. I would rather hear your questions and hear you guys have a discussion, ultimately. So maybe after 2 or 3 of the questions, we'll just throw it out to you guys, raise your hands, jump in, whatever. I mean, I think the idea is to be sort of casual here, and then if if I sort of think there might be an interesting follow-up, maybe I'll jump in at some point again. But and we have about an hour, right, or something like that. So I'm not a huge believer in opening statements, right? So we'll just jump right in. I'm going to start off with a question that you won't like, but that's okay because we'll get things started. So you want to be?
I object.
Right. You want to be the next Democratic governor of Virginia. The current Democratic governor of Virginia wants someone else. The previous Democratic governor of Virginia wants someone else. The one before that wants someone else. All the state delegates and state senators in Virginia, Democratic side, want someone else. Many of the mayors and city council, you get the point. Why are they all wrong? I mean, how do you've got a crowd, probably a lot of Democrats here. Why should they listen to you as opposed to all these folks that they've known for a long time?
Well, look, I have a tremendous amount of respect for them and in many ways want to continue those policies. I just think they made a mistake in trying to decide before they knew what the political landscape was. All of those people signed on when they assumed President Clinton, Secretary Clinton was going to become president. We all every night go to bed imagine what that would be like. And I imagine a lot of people who didn't vote this year think that very often. I hope they do. So look, it made a lot of sense. The play made a lot of sense. The assumption is that Tim Kaine would be in the White House with Clinton, that you would have Bobby Scott fill that seat as the first African-American senator in Virginia history, would be on the same ticket with Ralph. The Republicans would be at each other's throats over Trump having ruined the party, and you walk through and you have a theory of the case. Unfortunately, everyone woke up the day after the election and said none of that's true anymore. We're in an entirely different political landscape, but I guess we're just going to stick with this strategy. And what I heard, even from many of those who had endorsed, and certainly many of those who hadn't, that we were heading off a cliff. And as someone who cares a great deal about Virginia and Virginia politics, I wasn't going to look at an election that could determine the next 10 years or generation of politics in Virginia and allow the Democrats to have less than the best chance we could. And I was very confident that the campaign we would put together would give Democrats the best chance to win. The other thing I think that many in the establishment were a little slow to change to, particularly in the Richmond context, is what it meant for Trump to be elected. I've worked in countries with authoritarian leaders. I've worked in countries with racial demagogues. And I think at first there was some sense of this just being another transfer of power between Democrats and Republicans. I could tell on election night and the day after that that's not what this was. This was a much bigger deal in our country than some change from these to ours. This is an actual threat to our deepest values and institutions in a way that I think has become clear in the way that President Trump is governed. What's interesting about that, and I think what I've seen both from my organizing in the United States and elsewhere, is that within a crisis like that, you actually often have an opportunity to do real social transformation. And I think Virginia is a success story in this way. The two greatest challenges of our time, there are many, many challenges, but one has been the disappearance of work and the resulting radical inequality. GDP is no longer actually creating jobs in the way it used to. And the second is the persistence of racism and othering. Trump is not the creator of those dynamics, he's the result of those dynamics. And I believe that my state of Virginia is actually at the forefront of pushing back against those. And I believe if we run a kind of campaign that is bold about that, we can think bigger than just winning a governor's seat. And I think that's where I disagree with some of the folks in the party who think, if we can eke out another 48 or 49% like we've done in the last 3 elections, I think we have a chance to win with 55 or 56%. Pull along the House of Delegates with it. But we have to do it in a way that convinces people to show up. So I believe that gave us the best chance. I believe we were up against a greater threat than we've seen in the past. And I think the, frankly, much better success in the first 3 months than we expected speaks to the fact that we were ready like that.
Perfect transition. Talk about Donald Trump for a minute. You've said, I think I've seen you say in a couple of places, you want to make Virginia a firewall against the president, right? And that sort of goes with what you just said. But what does that mean in practice in a state where, Virginia Virginia is probably tied to the success of the federal government, federal contracting, military contracts, maybe more than any other state. In practice, if you're governor, getting into a war with President Trump and with the federal government, does that benefit Virginia? How does that? What kinds of actions do you take to, as governor, to push back against the federal government, and how do you work compromise?
Well, what I've said is that we will be a firewall against the politics of hate and bigotry from Donald Trump. And I do believe he ran the most viciously racist campaign in my lifetime. And I think it's important for us to say that and call it out with what it is. That doesn't mean every Trump voter is racist. I spend a lot of time with Trump voters. I think there are many good reasons to have told the establishment of both parties to go screw themselves. But I don't think that changes what the type of campaign was, and now we see governing in the same way. And I do think that means there is a moral and constitutional obligation on the governor to look at legal means available for noncompliance. And I have admitted very publicly that there's an irony of a Southern liberal running on a states' rights strategy, having certainly grown up in an era where that was the language of the right. So I spent a lot of time with constitutional lawyers both in Virginia and elsewhere and talked about this question of what it would mean to do noncompliance. And the fact is, of course, there's a strong progressive tradition, the fugitive slave law noncompliance being the best example. But even in the Virginia tradition, it was actually Jefferson and Madison that refused cooperation with the Alien Sedition Act of the Adams administration. And so I think in this case, there really has been a pendulum here based on what it means to represent the Constitution. So I think there is room to push back against that agenda. Obviously, you continue to partner with the federal government. In fact, one of the groups that's most under attack right now are our civil servants and our foreign service officers, many of them in Virginia, who everything from the hiring freeze to fears about whistleblowing to everything else. In terms of working together, I think what you've already seen is when President Trump came out and thought he'd make a big splash in Virginia with a promise about building a bunch of ships. What I sense from people is, one, they're starting to learn not to take him very seriously because he doesn't deliver on his promises. Two, if you couple that with massive slashes in development and diplomacy, not only does that net out as bad for the Virginia economy, but it nets out as bad for national security. And the defense people are the first to say it. They need the diplomacy and development legs of that. So I think in terms of working together, you always try to find ways to partner with the government on important actions, but you don't compromise on issues of hate and bigotry.
On one example that might be particularly current in the last couple of days, the Republican efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare failed. There's some indication, I think there's a lot of skeptics among the watchers of this, but there's some indication that perhaps the Republicans and maybe even the Trump administration will turn to Democrats to sort of figure out a way out of that and to compromise and to fix Obamacare. If the White House were to signal that they were open to working with Democrats as governor of Virginia or as a candidate for governor, do you think Democrats should work with the president to sort of fix some of the things that have gone wrong with the health care?
I certainly think we should be focused on making Obamacare stronger, as most people would probably know. I voted for the first version that was actually a lot stronger than where we ended up with, because I do believe we should be looking for ways to make it stronger. One of several divisions that developed, though, in this was the realization of many Republicans at the state level that Republicans in Congress were about to throw them under the bus. It was pretty clear that they were going to be block granting and shifting the tough decisions to Richmond and other capitals around the country. So I think there's a really good opportunity at the state level, which Governor McCourt announced he's going to do, to revisit the question of Medicaid expansion in Virginia, saying to these Republicans, look, these guys don't have your back up in Washington. They were about to make it look like you were the ones who wanted to kick old people and disabled people off of their health care, and instead, and actually potentially punish the states that had not taken the Medicaid expansion. So I think that we should be looking for opportunities to cooperate, and I think right now, if I was a Republican at the state level, I would be looking for how to work with the Democrats in my state legislature to get this thing stronger before Washington screws it up worse.
And one last question, we'll get to some of the students. On endorsements, when you ran for re-election as a member of Congress, the NRA actually endorsed you rather than your opponent. At the time, you said, your campaign statement said, Tom hasn't been afraid to stand up to members of his own party when it comes to fighting for the Second Amendment, and the NRA's endorsement will signify to Virginia gun owners they can continue to count on Tom to represent them. Since then, you've said the NRA has become a nut job extremist organization.
Not my most diplomatic moment, but
Right.
the sentiment is there.
Right. But here's what I don't understand, and maybe you can explain, is you seem to suggest that there's been a change in the NRA between the time that you embraced them and embraced their members and the time that you're now running this time. It's only been 4 years.
6 years.
Well, 2013, right? That was when you accepted the endorsement for re-election? Or
2010.
2010.
I was out of office after 2010.
Oh, okay.
I lost.
Okay, I don't know why. I knew that. I don't know why it's in 2013 here. But anyway, so it's been a few years. You can go back to 1995 when the NRA talked about jackbooted thugs, and you can go back to the 2000s when they ran all sorts
So
of...
they also supported universal background checks.
Yeah. So you're suggesting, though, that the NRA of the 1990s and the 2000s when they were running all those ads was not what they are today, and it's significantly changed since 2010?
I think that it has significantly changed. I think it's a valid question about whether they were not already in a bad place before. I think they were in many ways. But I think, you know, as someone who grew up in an area where it was primarily a membership organization for responsible gun owners, I think what you see now is that it doesn't represent responsible gun owners, it represents gun makers and survivalists. And basically the business model is how to sell as many guns as possible. And if you look at the national rates, a smaller and smaller percentage of people are buying guns, but there are more guns being sold. So the business model largely is to scare the crap out of people to buy up full arsenals. We saw that with the kind of response to Sandy Hook, obviously, when they said the answer here is more guns and more people and guns in classrooms. And you know, when the fight came over real meaningful legislation, you know, I was right in the middle. I was running a national advocacy group around mentioned to me, and specifically worked to target other former NRA endorsed members like myself, who we felt were moderate and would come around to support common sense gun reform, and fought very hard for that. In the 2 years I was in Congress, there wasn't a major legislative fight over gun safety. In fact, from the 1994 election cycle forward, basically the Democrats, correctly or not, had decided that that was unlikely to be an issue where they made a big legislative push. And I think it was, the party was slow and I was slow to react to the fact that the dynamics had changed around that in terms of what's possible. One of the things I've said in this campaign many times, and I really believe it, is that I grew up believing that movements change the world and politicians show up to take credit for it. I've now sort of modified that a little bit to say that it's a partnership. Movements change our sense of what's possible, and politicians have to work within the sense of what's possible. Now, at good moments of transformation, you have elected officials who are allies to movements, who are willing to take a bold definition of what's possible. I think in the gun safety movement and the gun safety space, the credit goes to the movements, things like the Virginia Tech moms and others, who pushed as a Democratic Party, including myself, who had accepted that these things were never going to happen politically, and kept saying that's not acceptable, we have to change the sense of what's possible, and different politicians at different points stepped up and started to work with that. Of course, the classic case on this is King and LBJ, right? You have those moments where, and this is one of my favorite movie scenes of all times, is the opening scene of Selma, when King and LBJ are in the White House. And some Johnson scholars felt like it wasn't fair to Johnson. I felt like he captured it perfectly. He's sitting there, he's not being a jerk in it. He's like, dude, back off a little bit. I just passed the Civil Rights Act. I'm trying to do the war on poverty, and you're hitting me on the Voting Rights Act. And King's sitting there saying, the Voting Rights Act is everything. It's power. And Johnson essentially says, well, you need to go change the politics of this issue to make it possible to do it, which is then Selma and Pettis comes from that. So I think in our moments of transformation and progress, you tend to have those two things working. Part of why I'm back in politics right now is I actually think it's a movement moment. I think the movement that has responded to the Trump administration is a genuinely diverse, pluralistic, and progressive movement in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And I think if we can combine that with campaigns that understand it's a movement moment, we will actually see transformational breakthroughs in the next 2 years that will put us in a position where we see the Trump's election not as the beginning of an unraveling, but as the last gasp of a dying racist ideology in the rearview mirror as this new and stronger America goes forward.
I definitely want to get back to this question of how that movement you see that movement maybe fueling your likelihood of success if you tap into it during this campaign. But before we do that, who's got some questions? Go ahead. And give your name and like your student, what year, and all that.
My name is Megan Bouvet. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service, and I was wondering what insights and lessons from your international experience have you applied to your domestic political experience, and how do those two experiences shape each other?
So I've actually somewhat intentionally tried to go back and forth between a foreign policy job and a domestic policy job because I think each makes me better at the other. When I sit down with a foreign head of state in diplomacy and they know that I've been elected before, there's a certain credibility that comes with that because I can work not just from a diplomatic space, but them knowing that I've lived in the world of politics. And the same thing coming back, which is that having done peace negotiations overseas, there are ways in which when you put yourself in a totally foreign culture and you're forced to try to walk in their shoes and understand what history and perspective got them there, then it's that much easier to be able to come here and having gotten elected in a red district, be able to sit down with Tea Party members, and maybe we don't agree, but I certainly have the experience of saying, hey, we may come from different cultural perspectives, but how do I understand and hear from your point of view? Sometimes it's quite specific things. When I did the quadrennial diplomacy and development review, I know you all read it. Actually, this is one of the few rooms that probably has read it. You know, it was interesting because we were looking at what are the pillars of foreign policy, and we ended up getting to the economic pillar, and I was talking to some of the counterterrorism folks, both at state and across the river, and they were saying that basically for many years we've tracked the stability of countries and therefore the likelihood of recruitment of extremists by looking at GDP and unemployment. But now, for the most part, they have come to find that those statistics are largely irrelevant. GDP used to give you a pretty good indication of how the economy of the country was going, but now it tells us almost nothing. Unemployment tells us less and less because of the number of people who are underemployed, who've dropped out of the search for jobs or are working 3 jobs to get by. So you might end up looking at things like the inequality rate, the corruption rate, how long does it take a young man to be able to afford his first home, which is often when he can get married, and other factors. And sure enough, when you think about that, I think American politics is also 10 years behind on this, where we still tend to look at things like GDP and unemployment as good metrics of how a state's doing. But in fact, they tell us very, very little. In Virginia, we've had small GDP growth. Largely that's been muted by the sequester and other limits. But median family income hasn't budged in about 15 years. We can look at unemployment, but up in Northern Virginia, you have a lot of people who are having to work 3 or 4 jobs in order to get by. You know, I'm a runner. I'm not a very good runner, but I run. And if I'm training for a 5K or a 10-miler, I train differently, right? Choosing your metrics matter. And I think that we have a more sophisticated set of metrics in public policy that actually policies end up driving to those metrics. If you're looking at issues like commute time, quality of life indicators, cost of daycare, other things that can be super significant in terms of affordability. So I do think there are a lot of ways in which we go back and forth. The other one, which you know, has just sort of been more of a personal issue for me, has been the issue of political courage and where we set the bar. And I've told various stories of this a lot on the trail, but you know, when I was in Congress, I got a lot of credit for being from a red district and supporting healthcare reform and climate change legislation and stimulus and DREAM Act and LGBT and everything else, and people said it was courageous. And I just felt like giving that much credit to a Democrat for doing that is setting the bar for political courage way too low. And part of that is that I've been working in countries where women, usually women, were literally risking their lives every day to try to end a civil war. That's courage. As I've said to other members in my own party and more recently to my Republican colleagues, you know, there are a lot worse things in life than being a former member of Congress. Being a former member of Congress was a great gig. So the idea that my risk was that I would leave office but have supported a change that's gotten millions and millions of people more affordable care, that seems like an easy choice. So I think it's easier to have that perspective when you put yourself in places where real courage is felt.
Thank you.
Another question. Go ahead. Or, yeah, either one.
My name is Becca DePietro. I'm a sophomore in the college. And I wanted to refer back to your comment about Trump's campaign being racist, which I think a lot of us in the room would agree with. However, how do you balance not alienating Trump supporters by calling out his campaign and drawing that connection between the quote elite and the white working class who supported Trump in your campaign?
Yeah. So I think it is a thin line, but it's an important one. One, I think you really have to call out Trump's statements and his actions. And 2, I think we want to keep an open-minded spirit about the fact that people have lots of complex reasons for doing something. I think the single most important thing is showing up. Showing up and having the conversation. It's so much easier for them to assume, you know, we hate every Trump voter and we have horns growing out of our head and it's easy to, you know, have the stereotype in reverse. But when you show up and have a conversation, it's easier to break that down. Second, what I find, and I think the reason I was able to succeed with, with a lot of deep red counties in Virginia in Congress and keep some of that vote the second time, is that I actually do believe the system is broken. I don't think it has been working for working and middle class folks, and I think a willingness to stand up and call that out is a permission slip for the conversation to continue. And I think we can do both of those things, and my opinion has always been we do it by standing up and being bolder, not by trying to sort of imitate a softer version of Republican language. And I'll just give you an example from this campaign so far. I was the only Democratic candidate to come out and oppose 2 gas-fracked pipelines and to refuse any money from Dominion Power, which is the largest contributor to both political parties in Virginia. And the media tended to want to treat that as a left-wing issue. But the fact of the matter is, it's been incredibly popular with Trump supporters in many of the red counties in western and southwestern Virginia. Why? Because they think the system is rigged for the power utilities. They think farmers and small business owners aren't getting a chance to produce their own energy. That's what we worked on in the 5th. We were helping farmers capture methane off of cow manure in order to power their own farms, but Dominion makes it almost impossible to sell back to the grid and actually seriously caps net metering. They can look across the border into North Carolina and see the solar jobs and the wind jobs and the weatherization jobs, and they're asking, why isn't it happening here? They also think it's the use of eminent domain for private gain. So I think that actually the lines are not a simple right-left line right now. A lot of them are this sort of Main Street to Wall Street kind of axis in addition to that. And I think, when we show up and try to be involved in these struggles, it's important. I'll give you another example from the campaign, and I'll try to make my answer short. We were also the first candidate to come out and set the goal of 2 years of free community college or career technical training in Virginia. And the interesting thing to me about this politically, as a policy matter, I'll give you all the reasons why I think it's good. But politically, it's worth noting that the 2 biggest users of the community college system are communities of color and rural counties. Same thing with raising the minimum wage in terms of who's most affected by that. So I think part of why I'm in this race is that I believe we've gotten wrong the kinds of issues that actually bring people together, and the things that bring people together are the issues that try to revive the basic American dream of giving small business a chance and creating real social mobility.
Can I just follow up real quick? There's a theory behind that, though, that somehow you can go to places like Southwest Virginia and somehow both have the conversation about how terrible and racist Trump is, and at the same time connect with them on the need for expanded free community college, which is a big deal out in Southwest Virginia. The evidence, the evidence of a liberal Democrat being able to go to Southwest Virginia and espouse the kind of rhetoric that you espouse about Donald Trump. The Clinton campaign didn't have any success in those kinds of places. If you look at the kinds of vote tallies in Southwest Virginia, vis-a-vis what Obama was able to get in previous Democratic Kane, Warner, the others. She did terribly in Southwest Virginia. She barely won Virginia, but that was all on the strength of Northern Virginia and to some extent Tidewater. So you really think that you can go down to Southwest Virginia and you'll do well?
Stay tuned. Yes. Look, when I ran in 08, I started out 36% behind. No Democrat had come within 19 points of that district as it had been redistricted. And if you had gotten a group of pundits together and described who would give us the best shot to beat Virgil Booth, you would have described the exact opposite of me. You would have said we need sort of someone with a good drawl, former business person probably, someone who's real moderate on all the issues, and has been living in the district forever. You wouldn't have said, let's go with a guy with 2 Yale degrees who's been hanging out in Afghanistan and Sierra Leone, and is to the left of the party on economic issues.
Well, maybe Sierra Leone.
Yeah, that was a big draw. So, look, I think that people are looking for a different kind of conversation than have been had. Now, look, I think part of the problem is that people didn't give Hillary a chance, and I think that had a lot to do with 30, 40 years of baked-in, partly gender critiques and other things that were not fair. I think she would have been an amazing president. But there's no question, if you look at the trust numbers, that they weren't there. I think that there was also more that could have been done to be present in those communities in certain races. But I think you have to have a message. You have to show up, you have to have a message. We launched the campaign in Danville, Virginia, and in a single day did Danville, Charlottesville, Fairfax, and Alexandria. because we want to represent the whole state. And yeah, I think we are already doing very well in these red states. But again, it's, I think that for several decades now, Democrats have sort of thought there's this perfect bio, that if you run the person with the perfect bio, they'll do well in those areas, and it's never worked, or pretty much backfires entirely. What they're looking for that's more important to them is someone who actually gets how those regions have been left behind and are willing to take on the big guys. And I think one of the challenges in politics, for me, the real mark of courage is where will you take on concentrated power and concentrated wealth? Because that's really what the axis is. And if you're not willing to start calling out the monopolies, you're not going to get that far in Southwestern Virginia. I do think there's the opportunity. I think it's working. And I think that's how we won in 08. It's how we outperformed the party by 12 points in 2010. And I think it's what we're doing now.
You had a question a minute ago.
I'm one of the gun safety advocacy team leaders for College Democrats. So my question's related to that. You mentioned the endorsement from the NRA and everything back in 2010. If you're elected, could we trust you to sign universal background check and assault weapon ban legislation if it came across your desk?
You can. I think that there's a better chance for the former than the latter. And I think part of that's going to depend on whether or not we can win back the House of Delegates this year, which is obviously a long shot, but I think it's not off the table. But absolutely, I've already fought, again, on the national level for the universal background checks and the gun safety measures that were part of the Manchin-Toomey bill. And I think, to me, that is totally consistent to support a Second Amendment right to responsible gun ownership and to support responsible limits.
Let's actually over here. Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll come back.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service, and I actually worked for the Clinton campaign for the Virginia coordinated.
Thank you.
So just getting back to, you mentioned briefly the healthcare debate that's happening right now. I know you mentioned a little bit about what's happening on the Republican side, but I think one of the things that we obviously saw during the primary is that there's also a lot of division in the Democratic Party on thoughts on healthcare, and there's thoughts on whether we're going to just fix Obamacare or move towards a single-payer Medicare for all system. So I'm wondering your stance on single-payer and Medicare for all type of healthcare.
Yeah, I was at the rally on the Hill, which had been organized, it was supposed to be a Kill the Bill rally, and then we were on the Hill right when the news came down that they pulled the bill. And so it was sort of this eerie, is this real, is this not real, suspended animation, and for me it was kind of moving to be within visible distance of where I'd gotten to cast the votes, and there was a certain sense of that all coming together. And you could tell, even in the Democratic responses at that rally, how many people were saying, almost nobody said, okay, now we don't have to worry anymore. The issue was being vigilant on efforts to continue gutting it versus what is the next step. And the goal is universal affordable access. The Affordable Care Act moves us much closer to that, but certainly doesn't solve the problem. And I think that what you're going to see at the state level is continued efforts to move towards those two goals, universality and affordability. Single payer is one of the ways to get there. It's hard to do a Medicare for all buy-in at a state level. There are a couple states that have looked at that. I think the Medicaid expansion should be the no-brainer in many cases. I think that we could see arguments for bringing the Medicare age lower. Again, that's mainly sort of a federal push. We also have a huge percent of people in Virginia on the VA system, which is effectively a single-payer system that still actually rates higher in performance by consumers than other systems. I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee and assumed that was not true and kept looking at it, and it was true, not that there aren't huge problems with the Veterans Affairs Committee. So I think these are all things that we want to look at. We also have a huge access problem in Virginia, particularly on the issue of mental health. One of the things I was proudest of and the ACA are most excited about was creating mental health parity in private insurance coverage. That's also in the Medicaid expansion, which means if we don't expand Medicaid in Virginia yet again, then that continues to be one of our most vulnerable populations that doesn't have access to either addiction services or mental health services. So I think it is a really healthy debate about where we go from here. I think looking at the Virginia landscape, as a politician, I'll work within the sense of what's possible, and I think some of those steps forward would be significant.
Do you think there's any chance that, I know this is you running for governor, but not Congress, but do you think there's any chance for a movement towards a single-payer system, given that President Obama couldn't do that when the Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress? I mean, that was sort of seen as a step too far in 09 and 10. Now you've obviously got a much different landscape, not to mention the president, but I mean, is there any reason that they should even begin to work towards that, as you said?
I mean, if you believe in it, you should be working towards it. That's how movements change things. If you had said 15 years ago, is there any chance that the Democrats are going to actually take on serious gun legislation, people would have said no. But a combination of movement advocacy and the tragic realities on the ground changed that willingness of the Obama administration to step up and say, we're going to put the full force of the White House behind this push. It fell short. But I think it has changed the politics of that issue for a long time. So I think that, same thing with us pushing for 2 years of community college. When you say we're just going from K-12 to K-14, it sounds pretty reasonable. When you say, free community college, people say, is that really possible? Can you do it? Well, what we're already seeing is some bipartisan consensus that this is the kind of thing we're going to need for a new dynamic workforce. So, I absolutely think movements are supposed to look at this and say, hey, let's look at what we need to get to and not just here. And it's reasonable for parties and politicians to say, hey, what can we get through in the next 2 years?
You had a question over there.
Hi, my name's Luis. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service, and I really like your message when you say that people are looking for candidates to go after concentrated power. But how did you come to that analysis of the political landscape? A lot of politicians will say, well, you move right or left, the traditional spectrum. Why did you single out monopoly and oligarchy as like the fundamental crux of politics?
I think it probably came from a combination of spaces, but some of it comes back to the foreign policy work. When I moved to Sierra Leone, it was considered hopeless by all of the elites. It was in the 9th year of the Blood Diamonds War. It was, 3 separate armed groups causing all sorts of mayhem. And everyone had basically given up, and the UN was locked in, along with the Brits, to a certain negotiating strategy, which I think had all sorts of perverse incentives in it. What I was able to do in working with these very brave women, and my role was, behind the scenes, it's all credit to them, was simply by creating a scenario in which they were forced to have a position at the table, and a different set of voices were there. That changed the nature of the talks. And the fact of the matter is that the best ideas rarely come from the top down because people are bought into the status quo. King says power is rarely given by the powerful, it must be commanded by the oppressed, right? So coming up in the oral history of the civil rights movement, seeing experiences like that happen. And what was liberating for me in that experience was that I finally realized that I didn't have to be the smartest person in the room. I could just use the structural privileges that I had to help amplify voices that were left out, that were smarter than me and smarter than the people in the room. And that's really what I've tried to do ever since, is to understand that when I can go into situations, it's not about me, it's about me using the ridiculous platforms and microphones that I have to be able to hand that to people in Southside who were not being heard. And that happened even during the stimulus debate, and that was some of the fight that I had even with President Obama's economists, where they really wanted a stimulus that would kind of jolt us back to 2006. And many of us were sitting there saying, my district needs to get back to 1986, not 2006. This has got to be a rebuilding of America's competitive advantage. This can't just be something that gets the market back. And seeing how those dynamics work. In Congress, when I got there, members would talk about votes being $50,000 votes, meaning if you voted with the people, it would cost you $50,000 in donations. By the time Citizens United had really come into force a few months later, people were referring to them as $5 million votes. And so a single vote could take you out in that way, and Republicans have now come to learn that. For example, the moderates in the state legislature, when Governor Brownback first put his terrible budget through, and they said no, and the Koch brothers came in and wiped out every single one of them in primaries. And so ultimately the currency of politics is money, and so a willingness to stand up to that is something that is much more difficult. I do think this is a challenge in the Democratic Party that is finally changing, which is that a lot of the very, very important issue silos in the Democratic Party don't necessarily have corporate power on the other side. And those are one set of things we need to advance. And then there's another set of issues that are fundamental questions of economic fairness, mobility, and justice, which do tend to have a very big push on the other side, which is why you rarely see minimum wage or anti-poverty things or issues about challenging racial disparity in contracting or other things that would actually challenge the status quo of that, be as high on the list of this. I wrote a piece for Democracy Journal after Congress talking about what I call the soft corruption of priorities, which is, yes, there are times in Congress and politics where there's sort of the money under the the money and you change your view. You know, like you are against payday lending and then you take monies from payday lenders and all of a sudden you think they're okay. The more typical version is just where by being around fundraising all the time, the things that you tend to hear about from people who can write $5,000 checks and $500 checks is going to have a different set of urgency. For example, in the first 100 days, we didn't do foreclosure legislation. We didn't do anything immediately on foreclosures in those 100 days. So I'm going home to constituents and everyone's talking about a very different set of things. So I think all those things can factor into it. So just the experience of listening and seeing both here and there, but often there's going to be a consensus among those who are okay with the status quo that is going to be a little bit different than what you hear outside that.
We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Suhaib. I'm a one-out law school, and I'm from Battleground.
Hey!
So I just wanted to ask you what your strategy is going to be for combating climate change in a state as divided and as conservative as Virginia.
Yeah. So questions about climate change in Virginia, and I am incredibly proud of Virginia in so many ways, but our status on clean and renewable energy is embarrassing. We are ranked dead last or next to dead last on every clean energy and renewable energy metric. And there's only one reason, and that's that Dominion Power is the biggest donor to both political parties. And the idea that a publicly regulated monopoly can give unlimited contributions to the very legislators who oversee that is an astounding failure of good government. The problem is, in addition to climate, it's also costing Virginia tens of thousands of jobs every year, and these are no longer hypothetical jobs. When the very conservative governor was in North Carolina a few years ago and got through this entire agenda full of very hateful bills and gutting public education and all of these other things, his biggest legislative failure was getting rid of the renewable energy standard, even though for him and the Koch brothers and Pope it had been a top priority. The reason was it had created too many jobs and too many small businesses in too many red districts. There's been a massive increase in clean energy-related businesses in North Carolina. In fact, there are more Americans today working in clean energy than in fossil fuel industries. But they're not happening in Virginia. We've been losing the solar market to North Carolina, and now we're in grave risk of losing the wind market to Maryland because Dominion bought up the offshore wind and is sitting on it. Not only that, they're basically trying to limit any form of distributed energy production, which is so clearly one of the job creators for the future. This is the ability for someone to basically sell power back to the grid. So, they'll kind of get out of the way if you just want solar on your own house, so we don't incentivize it. But if you actually wanted to do something that produced net energy, clean energy, and sold it back, they basically make it impossible. And this is a disaster for Virginia's economy. Several of the big blue chip, Amazon and others that have come into the state basically have said, you've got to let us do this because we've made a brand commitment to doing it. So some of the only wind and solar coming to scale in Virginia is basically these big corporations coming in to relocate, who they make an exception for, which shows that it's not that difficult to do. The interesting thing about this politically is that by the end of my 2 years in representing Central and Southside Virginia, they were much more bullish. The red parts of my district were much more bullish than even the Obama administration was on clean energy jobs. They couldn't understand why we weren't doubling and tripling down on this. And it wasn't the climate vote that they appreciated. It was the fact that we went and started to work with farmers and landfill recapture and other things. So I think it's a huge part of the future. Now, Virginia also disproportionately pays the cost because the Tidewater area in the Chesapeake Bay is one of the greatest ecological and economic drivers in Virginia. And it is being already deeply affected. We're seeing flooding. It could affect the next BRAC commission looking at the naval bases, et cetera. So this is a major, major issue for Virginia. We should be doing our part. Again, I'm the first major candidate to refuse any money from Dominion. And that's not because I won't sit down with them. They actually provide good services. They do good things with veterans. But when it comes to this stuff, they are at the back of the line. And as I've said to them, come to me, but win me over with the quality of your ideas, not the size of your campaign check. And until we're willing to elect someone who is going to negotiate from strength with them, we're going to see the same thing. So I believe we have a huge upside.
I believe the current governor and the former governor, Democrats, have all supported the offshore drilling that push that even the Obama administration wanted to do. Would you oppose offshore drilling off the coast of Virginia?
I would. Before, as part of the group that looked at how to do it safely and what it would take, I think we're now 10 years on from that, both in terms of the climate impact and the fact that the wind potential is so clearly greater, we shouldn't be doubling down on fossil fuel production. We should be looking at clean energy production. This is why the two gas pipelines spending $6.7 billion on these, when you could spend a third of that and create 4 times as many jobs doing weatherization, efficiency, smart grid, wind, and solar. So we just need to, get out of these anachronistic notions and look forward.
Okay. Other questions?
My name is Anas Rasulis. I'm a sophomore in the SFS, and as the son of 2 formerly undocumented immigrants, I'd like to know what will you do to protect Virginia's immigrant and especially the undocumented immigrant population on both the state and the federal level?
Yeah, incredibly important and timely question. We were did a series of meetings with DREAM Act kids and others across the state who, in that case, really felt like finally they had been given access to come out of the shadows and live the American dream, only to now not know what's going to happen. At CAP, we worked on both the DAPA and DACA regular executive orders under President Obama, and we're disappointed to see the Supreme Court's decision in the former case, but really do believe that these are life-changing measures. As governor, I think there are a couple of things that we can do. One, we can look, as we started the discussion, at what are the legal authorities available, and I think they are real, for non-compliance with executive orders coming from the presidency. They are not absolute. We are a rule of law country, but there is room in some cases to say we are not going to be putting state assets or authorities in these directions. I think second, there are places where we can ensure that laws that already exist are well communicated, including the safety of schools, of clinics, and other areas. I've met with public school teachers in multiple towns who've talked about students disappearing from school because the parents are terrified that ICE agents are going to come into the schools or other places. So some of that is about trying to make sure that we can distinguish, realities and myths that are out there. But it's an incredibly scary time. We have talked to interfaith leaders in Northern Virginia who've literally had members of houses of worship ask them to make sure that they've prepared binders about their children that include allergies, tutors, soccer schedules, and other things, so that if the parents disappear in the middle of the night, someone else in the parish can take the binder and take care of the kids. In 2017, that's just an incredible reality for us to be facing. So I think that this is something where we need to continue to be vigilant. Beyond the governorship, though, I will say, I do think that the grassroots resistance is working. I think that it has gotten through, not to the White House, but it has gotten through to some Republicans in Congress, both in terms of the travel ban and the bullying of refugees and this idea of tearing apart families. I think for those who actually are going to have to face the voters either this year or next year, they're noticing the crowds that are coming out and the fact that they're diverse, not just ethnically, but politically. You are seeing some independents and conservatives of conscience come out and speak out to this. So I think it's both a movement and activist push to continue to humanize and put a face on the terror people are feeling, and also looking for the executive authorities that are available as government.
One quick follow-up on that. CAP was, Center for American Progress was a big supporter of the DACA program and later the DAPA program. Do you regret that support, given that it encouraged folks who are undocumented to come forward, who are now have essentially presented themselves to, and now there's an administration that can use those lists to find them?
It was an issue that was, no was the short answer. I think it was right. I voted for the DREAM Act when I was in Congress, and I think that the real shame is that we fell a vote short in the Senate from that becoming law. That led to doing so through executive order. I think it was also a shame that despite the outcome of the 2012 election, a significant push by some Republicans, we were not able to get comprehensive immigration reform through. I was part of fasting down in the mall for that. Clearly, those would have been better approaches than doing so through executive order. But I think given the options that were available and the human scale, that it was right for the president to push those. There were people who raised the concerns at the time. Obviously, with the Supreme Court case, that was a constitutional question and turned down the DAPA orders. And in the DACA case, we'll see how this goes. But I think that, being beholden to what is the worst case scenario that could possibly come afterwards is too constraining of a threat. I think you also haven't seen the orders issued yet. Now, vulnerability is there. Had the had people never come out of the shadows in the first place, there would also be huge vulnerabilities that were there, including the interim. So it's a fair question to have raised. I think given what we knew at the time, it was the right thing to push on.
I think it looks like we've got a few more minutes. Hang on, there's somebody over here, maybe, and then a couple more. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Hi, my name is Uma. I study undergrad student here, and I'm actually born and raised and still live in Fairbanks County, Virginia. So super excited to be here. But I want to backtrack a little bit because I am fascinated by the idea that you did really well in the Reds district, and I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm really struck by the rhetoric of preservation used, like, outside of Northern Virginia, which is preserving, and you're seeing this is Corey Stewart using the rhetoric of, hey, let's preserve Confederate flags and they're threatening our culture, et cetera, et cetera. What do you say? I guess, how do you open the doors to that, your conversation and your dialogue on inclusiveness? What would you say to those Virginians who do feel threatened by this increased diversity, by those questions that, hey, Confederate flags may be provisional? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to remember that the reason Corey's so upset is that he's figuring out that his values are not Virginia values. I mean, Virginia not only rejected Donald Trump, and the only former Confederate state to do so, but he did worse than any Republican candidate in my lifetime in Virginia. From a Virginia perspective, he was the biggest loser. And I think that's significant when I think about the way Virginia has changed. Growing up, Virginia was more or less 20% African American and 80% white. Now it's about 20% African American and 20% other. And there has been this just beautiful and wonderful explosion of diverse communities across Virginia. I also think we've just become more progressive and inclusive, including in the very areas that Corey represents, which I think he is maybe upsetting to him, but I won't try to speak for him. So I think the fact of the matter is that Virginia is a very inclusive state. And it's not just Northern Virginia. On the refugee issue, I think the highest per capita rate of refugees in the country is in Harrisonburg, where Eastern Mennonite University and other institutions have been bringing in refugees from all over the world, and it's just one of the most fascinating, awesome places to live. On Friday, we did a concert in Falls Church, with the Sierra Leone Refugee All-Stars, who had reached out and said, you did so much for Sierra Leone, we'd like to do something helpful. And we thought it was really cool to shine a light on all the awesome things that refugees bring to the table. So I think first and foremost, we should not cede that sense of what Virginia values are. The second is to understand that the loudest voices in the room are not always representative. I have not sensed when I go out and meet with Trump supporters and conservatives that they're excited about this sort of chest thumping about bullying refugees or other things. The Confederate flag is its own symbol and has its history with it. I think what we're seeing now, which I believe is very, very important, is a more systematic set of questions about how we tell our past in order to understand what it says about our present and our future. And this comes to the transitional justice work that I've done in other countries, which is if you look at some of the countries that have been more successful in transitioning from a civil war, from atrocity to out, it tends to be those who have taken some sort of a systematic role, whether it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or accountability or what have you. Now we're several generations out from that in that particular case, but not that many generations out if you think about the fact that the flag largely came into being more as a anti-integration symbol than it was ever as a Confederate symbol. So, I think it is important and right that communities are asking questions about what they should name high schools and where statues should be. And I think where it's done systematically and methodically, it can be something that really brings people together to have a very interesting and important conversation. I think where it becomes a political football, like so many other things, it's going to be something where kind of desperate candidates who are looking for attention will take a swing at it and see what happens. But I think at the end of the day, Virginia really has come a long way. The first campaign I worked on in the 9th grade was Doug Wilder's campaign. And to me, it was a huge deal that Virginia not only elected an African-American governor, but did it before any other state in the country. So we are both the birthplace of American democracy in the Declaration of Independence, but also the birthplace of American slavery. And there's always been in Virginia those two forces were really the cutting edge, with all due respect to Massachusetts, of freedom and liberty, but also we have this very serious...
You just lost the Massachusetts vote. Wait till that comes back to haunt you when you're running for president.
And which of those defines our future? And I think it'll be the liberty.
Okay, so how about 2 more questions? You, and then if you want to do one at the last one, then I have one last one and we'll finish.
So Zach Israel, and first off I want to thank you for voting for Obamacare nearly 7 years ago, and literally saving people's lives through that vote. My question is, so I live in DC, and over the last several years I've gotten way more involved in progressive community groups in DC, both within the official Democratic Party and some others. And there's definitely been a groundswell since Trump's been elected to help Democrats nationally because we're such a Democratic city. So obviously Virginia would be #1. But there's a lot of Democrats who are sort of holding back right now. And they say, oh, well, we'll help in November for whoever the Democratic nominee is. But the June primary is coming up. We don't really know the distinction between Ralph Northam and Tom Perriello. We're sort of going to sit this one out. We don't really know much about the differences between the two. So what would you say if you were talking to a DC Democrat who wants to volunteer potentially in June about why they should help you over Ralph Northam? What would you tell them?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say get involved in primaries. I think that the wrong lesson to learn from recent years is that engaging in primaries is somehow a toxic behavior. I think it expands the strength of the party, the base of the party. It has an important engagement of ideas. It's also one of the best moments for progressives to actually get what they want. During elections, politicians need voters. After elections, voters need politicians. And so it's a moment where I think we can have these important debates within the party. We believe that we've really set, John Podesta, who was Hillary's campaign chair, called our primary the blueprint for the future of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of pressure. But I think that what we really are trying to do is a walk and chew gum strategy of both leading on the fierce resistance to Trump, which many people criticized us for at the beginning as being not a sufficiently local issue. But I think that if you're spending time in communities of color, there's nothing more local right now than the Trump administration. If you're a woman who cares about choice, there's nothing more local than the justices that are being presented and others. But second, I think it's very important for us to be able to offer a better alternative. A genuine alternative of inclusive economic growth. And I think what we're trying to put forward is a new generation of ideas that could work in an era, frankly, of automation. Automation is going to make globalization look like child's play. Somewhere between 38 and 50% of jobs in Virginia could be at high risk in the next 15 years. We're going to be seeing people moved out or kicked out of jobs very, very rapidly. That is combined with a consolidation in the economy of the new monopolies. That is why you've seen the vast majority of growth, even in a state like Virginia, concentrated in the top 3%. That is an environment in which if Trump is the only person who shows up and speaks to those changes and says, I want you to blame black and brown people for it, there's going to be a certain amount of appeal, even if you don't accept the racial part, to at least showing up and acknowledging that the situation, the social contract isn't working the way it is. That's why we were the first candidate in Virginia history to support a living wage of $15 an hour. We were the first candidate in Virginia history to support the idea of 2 years of free community college or career technical training program. We came out with a bold agenda on criminal justice reform, but also we were willing to talk about the racial wealth gap in Virginia, where today the median net worth of an African-American family is still 1/11 of that of the median white family. We are effectively a new Jim Crow state. We can both give our coalition a reason to show up in an off-year election, which I think Democrats often assume is impossible, while still appealing, even to those people who've left the party. Why? Because the two greatest users of the community college system, as I mentioned, are our base and those we're trying to reach. The two groups most likely to be suffering a minimum wage, which in Virginia is $14,000 a year, lower than West Virginia, are going to be our coalition and those we're trying to reach. Same issue with talking seriously about turning addiction from a criminal crisis into a public health crisis. In a state where 3 Virginians die every day of the opioid epidemic, this is something we should be treating with moral urgency and understanding that there are new political coalitions that can form around this. I think many progressives get upset about the fact that they're asked in September and October to go knock doors and make phone calls for a candidate that they may not be that excited about by that point. Well, the way to change that is to show up and get involved in a primary and help shape an agenda that is the kind of thing you want to put in 60 hours a week knocking doors and making phone calls We want to be that campaign for people. You can go to tomforvirginia.com. You can volunteer with us. And it really is, I think, something where we're building this from the grassroots up. We're doing a lot of it outside the party establishment. We think this is the moment to do that. You go to committee meetings for the party, and they have 100 people, and they've never had more than 20, and it's awesome. And you go a few blocks away, and there's an indivisible meeting with 500 people. I think if we can turn this movement and resistance energy into political power, we are going to build a new coalition and a new agenda like we've never seen before. If our resistance is only good at protesting and doesn't end up defining both primaries and general election votes, then the typical politician will look at it and say, oh, that's well and good, why don't you guys go have another march, but we don't have to take you seriously. Now is the time, and I mean now to June 13th, because there are only a couple of beta tests around the country this year of what the new Democratic Party is going to look like. We believe our primary is pushing the envelope on that, and so far the response has been awesome.
One last question.
Well, you answered most of my question, but I wanted your response to this critique of Democratic tactics, which is that I think a lot of people would say after the election we just had that ideas no longer seem to be the animating force in politics, and the way that guy in the White House won is by furthering the emotional connection that voters have to the candidate. And I think Democrats do really well when when Democrats have an emotional connection to the candidate. But when we run people that are more fact and idea based, that allows Republicans to come in, especially in a state like Virginia where they can gin up controversy, work on that emotional appeal. And I'm wondering, I think you're such an interesting candidate because you are from a red district. I'm wondering where you see that balance being between ideas and emotions.
Well, I'm going to geek out for a second, and I think, again, it comes back to something from spending time in very different cultures. I really have come to believe that there are two ways we find truth or wisdom, logos and mythos. And the Democratic Party tends to be all logos and no mythos, and the Republican Party tends to be all mythos and no logos. And I think a really good and healthy discourse is one in which we actually draw on both of those traditions. You can be in countries with very, very ancient forms of wisdom, and I can come in and say scientifically why it's not true, but there's also often truth that has survived through centuries in that. If we look at how the ACA has survived, I think there are two reasons the ACA has survived so far. The size of the protests and the stories. It wasn't the facts. I went out and told the facts. But what penetrated was people telling their stories. And I do think storytelling is very, very powerful. And I think it didn't get through to the White House, but at least got through to some members of Congress. When you have enough constituents showing up, first, the size really does matter. And then you're hearing people talk about the ACA having saved their lives. One of the reasons I have no regrets about that vote is every couple of weeks somebody comes up to me and says, my kid's alive because of the ACA. We didn't go bankrupt because of the ACA. One of those stories would have been enough for me to lose my seat, right? But when you're getting them constantly. So I do think that we need to understand it and not see it, and I think some Democrats sometimes see it as being beneath us to do storytelling or to talk about narrative. But actually I think it's something deep about our humanity that we partly understand and relate to each other by sitting and hearing someone tell their story. It's the 3 cups of tea idea from Afghanistan. You know that guy ended up being but that is in fact a tradition, and it's one I've been a part of.
How about The Hero's Quest by Joseph Campbell?
There you go. There, you know where I was breaking some of this from then. Yeah. Yes, so I think that there is something to that. It's why we watch films. It's why those of us on the left love art and culture so much. And it's not a fact-based thing when you look at a painting or a film, right? But we draw truth from that. So this is also the exciting part, and maybe I can just end on a positive note, which is that I do actually believe still that there is a lot more that unites us and holds us together than divides us. I think the tendency towards tribalism is strong, and modernity is not getting rid of that. The question is how we define it. You know, when Bruce Springsteen says we take care of our own, that can have very different meanings in that song depending on whether we're defining that as common humanity, as a common nationalism, as a state, as an ethnic group, etc. And I think right now that's going to be the question. How much do we see the Trump moment as an ability to divide with some of these sort of more divisive identities, or do we come back together and say, you know what, he was right to be showing up and saying that things aren't quite where they used to be. Some of that's great. We're glad we're not where we were in the 50s in these ways, but we're also bummed that we aren't living up to the promise of social mobility that we may have had at another time. Let's figure out how to build on the greatest hits of the past, but also improve where we go forward.
So I think we'll wrap it up. I can't let you get away without asking you whether you think I-66 should be widened inside the Beltway. No gubernatorial candidate should get away from that. Should it be widened inside the Beltway?
It should, but we're not going to solve it with more lanes. We really need to be combining that with greater transit and another tunnel underneath to, from Rosslyn over and looking at parallel roads. I mean,
should they build the hot lanes? They put the hot lanes inside? That's what they're doing next, right?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that it's not as bad of a deal as the Portsmouth Tunnel, which I think is one of the great disasters in recent Virginia political history. That is really, really crushing to the city of Portsmouth and many of the working class that meant to cross that tunnel. My sense is that people have learned some lessons from that and how they're doing this one, but that was in the details.
Thank you guys for coming.